background. I have to pick up my daughter at 3 o'clock. So instead of being late, I just thought it'd be easier if I took advantage of the technology and did it from the parking lot of her school. So this is a modern world. My wife usually picks her up on Wednesdays, but my wife is in St. Louis today, and she's actually speaking at a rally on transgender issues, and it's a sort of Passover rally, and she was invited to give a talk, and I said, go ahead, go do it. And so she's there right now. So our topic is the presidents and the Jews. Now, this is a quite an interesting topic, and it is relevant today, and the history is also relevant. You know, sometimes we study history and we don't see what the actual kind of contemporary relevance of it is. But in this case, the way the United States has related to the Jewish people has been quite interesting and formative, and has changed, but has generally been positive. And this is unique in human history. It is unique in human history. In you know that famous line from Fiddler on the Roof. Do you have a prayer for the czar? Yes, keep the czar far away from us. You know, that in general, in most times in history, the relationship between Jews and kind of the political authority has been terrible. You know, just basically in the best circumstances, it was leave us alone. We'll pay our taxes, leave us alone. In the United States, however, Jews have kind of been part and parcel of the formation of the country. Now, there have been ebbs and flows, and there's certainly been anti-Semitic presidents, anti-Semitic politicians, anti-Semitic eras. There's no question about it. But the general trajectory of Jewish history in the United States has been extremely positive. And that starts at the very beginning with George Washington. And so that's what we're going to start with today. Now, let me give you a little bit of context, because this can help us kind of understand sort of why Washington responded the way he did. Now, America is the first political nation, born during the Enlightenment, right? So the Enlightenment is an important period in world history, mostly Western Europe, which promoted free thought, the ability to use reason, a decline in religious prejudice. This comes after the 30 Years' War, where many people were killed on the basis of religion. And so you begin with John Locke and a couple of the early modern philosophers to get the idea of religious toleration, to say, we have different religions. No one religion has a monopoly on the truth. Of course, this is a new idea at the time, but it starts to spread through Western Europe. People like Voltaire, other kind of free thinkers, and these Enlightenment ideas are in the air, and they're influencing kind of the elites, the philosophers, the landowners. In the American Revolution was really led by primarily a kind of elite class who were exposed to a lot of these Enlightenment ideas. So the Enlightenment is shaping cultural life in Western Europe. However, there has not been a country that is built on the Enlightenment until the United States. And I remember there's a French Revolution in 1789, which is certainly shaped by Enlightenment ideas, but that's 13 years after the American Revolution. So the United States is the first country that kind of emerges out of the Enlightenment experience. And so the founding documents of America reflect that. And when we look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we notice something very significant, is that Jews are not mentioned at all, which is quite interesting, because most of the countries of Western Europe are built out of Christianity, right? The Holy Roman Empire, each state in Europe had its own kind of version of Christianity. France was fairly Catholic. England, if you've seen the play Six, the Henry VIII, established the Anglican Church and kicked the Catholic Church out of England. Germany is more Lutheran. So, but they all were built kind of on this foundation of Christianity, and Christianity is built on the foundation of rejecting Judaism. So Jews were kind of always inherently second-class citizens in most European countries. America, actually, Holland is sort of formed out of free thinkers as well, but that's another. I mean, Holland is really formed out of the Calvinist tradition, which was more tolerant of other religions, but it's still a Christian tradition. The United States is the first country that is really built on a kind of universal freedom of religion. And this is enormously significant because for the first time, Jews are not by definition second-class citizens. Now, there were certain areas where, of course, Jews are treated as second-class citizens. It's not this, in history, you have to look at the difference between de jure and de facto. So de jure is what the law says. De facto is the reality on the ground. Now, de facto, there was still anti-Semitism. There were still places where Jews were second-class citizens. But de jure, the laws of the United States did not establish Jews as second-class citizens. In fact, the Constitution says there shall be no religious test for office, which is a tremendous change. And then, of course, later on, you get the First Amendment, which is Congress shall make no law establishing, respecting the establishment of a national religion. So this sets a context in which the experience of Jews is going to be different. Now, when George Washington becomes president in 1789, so this is after the Revolution, you have the Articles of Confederacy for a while, the Jewish population of the United States is tiny, a couple thousand, In fact, the research I found said Jews were about 0.1% of the American population in 1790, 0.1%. So, and that, for context, today, Jews are close to 2%, between 1.7 and 2%. Depends on how you count, depends on all kinds of other factors, but much larger percentage of the population and much larger population. But at that time, Jews are tiny. I mean, the American population itself is small, and then Jews are a tiny percentage of that. So, and Jews predominantly lived in 4 main cities. Can anyone guess what those 4 cities are? Any ideas?
Newport, Rhode Island?
No, you would think so. There are certainly Jews in Newport, but it's not one of the 4 population
What
centers.
about Charleston, South Carolina?
Charleston is one of them.
Philadelphia?
Philadelphia is another one. The other 2 are
Well,
New
Baltimore?
York?
New
No,
York
not
City?
yet. New York already has a big Jewish population. No one's going to get the 4th one. It's a tough one.
Savannah, Georgia.
You got it.
Savannah.
You got it.
Went to
That
the-
is
visited
Savannah,
the
Georgia.
temple there. We went to
Yes.
services at that temple once. That's the only reason I know.
Yeah, it's a beautiful temple. It's one of the oldest. Yeah, Savannah, Georgia, which kind of makes sense. I mean, it's a great port. It's certainly a trading center. So yeah, Savannah, Georgia. So Savannah, Charleston, Philadelphia, New York. Those are the 4 main population centers. Of course, Newport, Rhode Island has some, and Jews are, there are certain other areas, but those are the 4 main ones. Now, almost 100% of American Jews at this point are Sephardic also. There's very few Jews from Germany or Europe, Sephardic Jews. Now, why Sephardic Jews? Because Sephardic Jews were really the first kind of traders. They were merchants. They sent goods back and forth. They were money changers. They were traders, merchants. And many of them were, ultimately from Spain that were originally lived in Spain, then were exiled to Portugal and Amsterdam, and then ultimately made their way around the world. And there was and those who came to America were traders. When Spain would send goods or France would send goods to the United States, there would be money exchanges, and merchants, Sephardic merchants, would send goods back or send money back and facilitate the kind of trade that existed. I mean, it was important work. By the way, that's where Alexander Hamilton, the West Indies, these were all Sephardic. He went to a Jewish school. There's speculation he was himself Jewish, or at least his father was Jewish. I mean, we're going to have a whole adult education on that topic. But the Sephardic merchants were important kind of, parts of they were wheels, so they were part of the chain, the supply chain of the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. The Sephardic Jewish merchants were a key part of that. And so those were most of the Jews who were living in the United States. And they were Orthodox, although interestingly, you think Orthodox, there was not much observance. I mean, there was no kosher meat. There was not, the synagogues themselves maintained a kind of Orthodox tradition, but it was not, the population wasn't observant in the traditional sense. And ultimately, most of that population intermarried and was lost to Jewish history. I mean, there are very few American Jews today who can trace their lineage back to Sephardic Jews of that era. I would venture to say there are probably none. I mean, you might find some, or maybe some who claim it, but it was very difficult to sustain that Jewish community because there was nobody to marry. It was so small. I mean, if you wanted, I'm sure some of their children went back to Europe, but it was very difficult to sustain that community, especially at that time. If you married somebody not Jewish, you essentially converted out of Judaism. So that population ultimately was kind of lost to history, but at the time it was important. Now, George Washington becomes president, and he actually relied heavily on a particular Sephardic Jew named Chaim Solomon. Chaim Solomon's a very interesting person. He comes from a Sephardic Jewish background, but he was actually born in Poland, which was not common at the time. Most Jews who lived in Poland were Eastern European. They came from Germany, or they came, from England who were exiled there, but a few came from Spain, and Chaim Solomon was one of them. He comes to America in the early 1770s. And he's essentially he's a broker. He helps when goods were shipped from France to the United States. He would exchange the goods for dollars and send it back. And then he ultimately becomes the agent for French troops fighting in America. So remember, Marquis de Lafayette. There's a great, interesting history about French soldiers who came to the United States and fought in the American Revolution. And Chaim Solomon was appointed by the French Council in America to essentially be their pay. He was their banker. He assured that the funds arrived in their accounts, or that it got to them, however it was. And he would probably lend money when necessary. But he was an all-around kind of broker and financier for French troops in the United States. But then he ultimately partnered with Robert Morris. Robert Morris is sort of the most important financier of the American Revolution, and they became partners. This is in the mid 1770s, so this is even earlier. And they joined together in helping finance the American Revolution. And this is a very important role, right? The United States, when I was researching this a little bit, in 1781, we know Yorktown, George Washington was with Count de Rochambeau, and they were marching from Hudson Highlands to Yorktown for the final blow against the British. But Washington had no money. It was out of money. And according to scholars, Washington's troops needed uniforms, they needed food, they needed supplies, and they were close to mutiny. And Washington needed $20,000 the equivalent of about 16 million today. So not a small amount of money. And he turned to Chaim Solomon, and Chaim Solomon was able to get the money and got it to Washington and helped Washington win the war. He also did lots of other things. He would help troops who needed loans. He helped facilitate war aid from France and from the Dutch Republic during the war. So he really played an important role in the American Revolution, and he was highly lauded for that. So in some ways, from the very beginning, Jews were kind of contributing to the American Republic. You know, he was sort of the equivalent, you could say he's the equivalent in America of the court Jew of Europe. Now that has a sort of negative connotation in European history, but that was a not an uncommon role for Jews, very small number of Jews, but they would serve as financiers for the ruling powers, so to speak. Yeah, Gail.
I just wondered if anybody in this august and educated group knows how there happened to be the statue of Chaim Solomon, Robert Morris, and somebody else I can't remember on Wacker Drive.
George
state.
Washington, Gail.
George Washington. There you go. I knew it was somebody
The
else.
three of
Thank
them.
you, Lila.
I've been wondering that too. I know that statue. I don't know why it would,
How it just came about. We'll research that.
Yeah,
It's
I
in a
wonder
very
what the
prominent place.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
I mean, there's Robert Morris College, right? That's in the Loop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good
Oh.
question.
Subject for research. Okay.
Good. Yeah. Other questions about okay, so Chaim Solomon helps finance the war. When the war is over, Washington kind of takes a victory lap, one could say, and he visits different cities. And it's in his visit to Newport, Rhode Island, which Rhode Island is the last state to ratify the Constitution, interestingly. So he's in Newport, Rhode Island, and a group of prominent citizens greets him. And this is in August 1790. And one of the people who greets him is Moses Sextus, warden of Newport's Turo Synagogue. Some of you, I'm sure, have been there. I've been there. It's a really beautiful synagogue. The synagogue itself was founded in 1763. He's one of the people, and they present Washington with letters. And then Washington writes back his letters of response. And it is this famous letter that I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, hold on, let me see here, share screen. Okay, where did I put the letter? Here we go. Can everyone see it? Okay. All right. Yeah. So I'm going to read some of okay. To the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, he gives him greetings. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger, the revolution, which are past, is rendered more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. He's saying how great the United States is, so forth. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy. What a beautiful phrase. A policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience, and immunities of citizenship. This is very important here. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by indulgence of one class of people that another enjoy the exercise of their inherent rights, of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Okay, this is such a beautiful, the language is, it's not simple writing. It's not always clear, but it is very powerful. And what's important here is that he says it is no more that toleration is spoken of. So toleration is the idea that we'll put up with you. You know,
Yeah.
you can live in our country so long as you pay your taxes and don't lift your head too high and don't think of yourselves as so important. We'll tolerate you living here. Washington, which was, in some ways, the policies of some countries in Europe. I mean, if it wasn't overt anti-Semitism, at best it was toleration. We'll tolerate you living among us. Washington is saying, we're now beyond toleration. If you are a good citizen and you are part of this country, you are on equal ground with everyone else. And that is a tremendous change. That is a shift in consciousness to say Jews are not other anymore. Jews are equals with every other group. And that is that is unique. And this is the first country that does that. Ultimately, France tries to do that. In theory, doesn't work out. But here he's saying we're moving beyond toleration. This is an Enlightenment idea. John Locke also spoke about moving beyond tolerance to true equality. And then he says these famous words, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And that is, these are words that have been cited for a long time, that we are a nation not built on this type of persecution. We're a nation built on equal rights. And then he says here, it would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and my fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants. And then he cites biblical language. Everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, which is from the book of Micah, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and darkness in our paths and make us all in our several vocations useful here and in his own due time, way everlastingly happy. George Washington. What a beautiful letter. Okay, and the equivalent of this letter is sent to the other synagogues besides Newport. It's sent to Savannah, New York, and Philadelphia as well. So this is a very positive beginning. The first American president is embracing a policy of Jews are not other anymore. Jews are part of the American founding. What's interesting with Washington too, and now we're going to move to Adams and Jefferson, especially in contrast to Jefferson, Washington has a more positive view of religion, right? Jefferson is tolerant of Jews essentially, but he doesn't like any religion generally. Jefferson doesn't like the Old Testament. Jefferson doesn't like supernatural God. Jefferson, edits the Bible. Jefferson is as close to a kind of secular thinker as we get in the early republic. Washington views religion very prominently. In his farewell address, Washington essentially says, we have to maintain some sort of religious character in the United States or we'll lose our national character. So Washington views Jews positively as a religion and as a people. And that is a difference from some of the other founders. Yes.
I've heard that Jefferson was a deist. Can you explain that?
Yeah, this is so Jefferson is such an interesting figure. Now, a deist is somebody who says there is a God, but that God is essentially like a watchmaker who creates the watch and then lets it go. And then the watch operates, but it's not controlled by God. It's not controlled by the watchmaker. So deists would say the universe operates according to natural law. It may have been created by some external power, but there's no God pulling the strings of what's happening. Jefferson basically liked the Bible as a book about human beings. And Jefferson, there's a famous, the Jefferson Bible, you can find it today, where he essentially cut out all the supernatural parts. He cut out the Jesus performing miracles. He cut out the splitting of the Red Sea. He cuts out all the stuff that doesn't make sense scientifically or rationally from what he saw, and he kept all the rest of it. And so Jefferson, really was sort of the Enlightenment extreme reason. Jefferson particularly didn't like, he sort of saw the Old Testament God as kind of vengeful and focused on law. So he didn't really love the Old Testament, but he was, Jefferson famously wrote the Virginia Articles of Religion, which were the sort of paradigm for the First Amendment that said we should have freedom of religious conscience. There should be no religious coercion. There shouldn't be people who say you have to believe this, you have to believe that in order to be a citizen or in order to be in government. So that was sort of Jefferson's contribution, in that he didn't like any religion. Sort of like Voltaire. Voltaire didn't like any religion either. Adams, let's move. So Adams was quite interesting. So if you look at some of the things that John Adams wrote in his life, he actually wrote some very positive things about Jews. There's a quote from Adams. Where is that? Let me find that. It's a really good quote. Where he said, how is it possible that he should represent the Hebrews in such a contemptible light? He's writing about Voltaire, who didn't like Jews. Voltaire didn't like anybody, but they are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bauble in comparison of the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. That's beautiful. Abigail Adams also liked the Jews, However, Adams is a little bit more complicated. The complicated thing about Adams is that he kind of liked Jews in theory, and he liked Jewish history, Jews as a nation, as is ancient Israel. But modern Jews, he didn't really, he had a more negative, as you can tell from this quote, he sort of romanticized Jews. He romanticized Jewish history. He didn't really engage with Jews of his day, of his time. Interestingly, here, this is who wrote this? Yeah, Michael Feldberg. This is very interesting. He also saw them as individuals who deserved rights and protections under the law. Like many of his peers, Adams venerated ancient Jews and thought contemporary Jews worthy of respect, but found Judaism, the religion of the Jewish people, an anachronism, and the Jewish people candidates for conversion to Christianity. So this is a very important distinction. People who view Judaism or ancient biblical Judaism in a positive light, but see modern Jews as sort of Talmudic, rabbinic, legally focused, and distorting the glorious heritage of the prophets and of ancient Israel. So this was actually a common Enlightenment prejudice that even sort of the Reform movement was kind of built with some of this prejudice to say ancient Judaism is great, but modern Judaism has been corrupted by the Talmudic and intellectual we call pupil. That's the sort of phrase of just kind of obsessing over details, that the law has replaced the spirit. So Adams kind of fell into that prejudice, which was not uncommon. There were many enlightened people had that prejudice. By the way, people still have that prejudice today. People who say, who have a positive view of Jewish history, but a less positive view of Jewish practice and tradition. Although Adams generally, in terms of policy, Adams continued the kind of, there was no restriction on Jewish life and practices under Adams. Neither was there restriction under Jefferson. Jefferson, as I said, he kind of had a more negative view of religion generally. But what Jefferson contributes is this sense of what we call the separation between church and state. There should be a wall. It was Jefferson who coined that phrase, a wall separating church and state. Now, the context in which Jefferson says that is actually in a letter to a Baptist minister. So the Baptists at that time, the Baptists were very worried that they would have to abide by certain beliefs that they didn't believe, and that they would be barred from holding political office and so forth because of their beliefs. And so Jefferson assured them that there is a wall of separation, that you can practice your religion and the government is not going to tell you how to do it. But when you practice your religion, your religion is not going to shape what the government does. This is what is so beautiful and unique about America, that the separation between church and state benefits both, in a sense that the state doesn't interfere with religion. So basically, you can start a religion about anything. You could start a religion, believes whatever you want it to believe. There's like 2,000 religions in the United States, and you don't need a government. You don't need a government sanction to start a religion. Now you have to get certain tax. If you want to be treated tax wise as a religion, there are certain things you have to meet, but they're minimal. They're minimal. That's, by the way, if you want to do a wedding, maybe some of your kids and grandkids have done this. You can become a minister for a day, and that's totally legal. All you got to do is you pay a fee it's called the Church of Life, and you pay them a $9.95 fee, and you are, according to the state, you are a minister. And that's because the government doesn't regulate religion. Government regulates a lot of other things. You want to become a cosmetologist? You want to cut people's hair? You have to go through to be regulated. You want to be a doctor? Of course, you got to be regulated. You got to. With religion, you don't. And on the other hand, that means that government law is not based on religion. Now, this, of course, this is part of the conflict over abortion today, or over other issues, school vouchers, these kind of things where people want religion, the government, to promote religious values. And that is that traditionally, because of the wall of separation, that's not permitted. So the way Rabbi David Saperstein sort of taught me about this is you can pass a law that is promoted by a religious figure, but there has to be a good secular reason to pass that law too. Government should not pass laws simply because a person believes it or a majority believes it because of religious values. So you can't pass a law saying that the Bible should be read in schools because it's good to read the Bible. Now, theoretically, you could pass a law saying the Bible should be read every morning in schools because it reduces school violence. If you could prove that, that's very difficult to prove. So if there is a good secular reason for something that seems to promote religion and the courts could deem that it did, then it could be permissible. But in general, it's not. And that allows religion to sort of freely develop. Religion is sort of, there's almost a marketplace of religion in the United States. Religions compete on their own. Religions raise money on their own. They develop programs on their own. And that's different than in Europe. Most religious groups are funded by the government. Like in Germany, if you're Jewish, I remember if you're Jewish and you're in Germany, when you pay your taxes, you tell them what religion you are, and then a portion of your taxes, let's say you live in Frankfurt, a portion of your taxes goes to fund the Frankfurt Jewish community. And the government sends a check to the essentially the Federation of Frankfurt, and that fund pays the rabbis, pays the cemeteries, pays the building upkeep, all of that. And in general, that's bad, because it just, I don't want to sound like ultra conservative here, but in general, if you're going to get a check, regardless of what you do, it doesn't get you to be competitive. It doesn't get you to be creative. You're going to get paid either way. So why innovate and create programs and do kind of things if you're just going to get a same check from the government? And that's, religion is essentially dead in Europe because of that. You look in England, less than 5% of the population ever goes into a church. In the United States, religion is declining, but we still have a much more vibrant religious life than other countries. And it's Jefferson that really is responsible for that sort of thinking about the separation between church and state, or you could say religion and government. The two should be kept separately because they serve different ends. Another way to think about it is, in general, politics and government is all about compromise. Now, it doesn't seem to be that way today, but at its best, government compromises because you're representing different people. So you have to compromise and come up with different solutions, and not everyone's going to be happy, but you compromise. Religion, essentially, in its purest form, is about not compromising. It's about having certain convictions that you stick to. So the two should be separate. Okay, Sue.
Talking about separation of church and state. As you know, Rabbi, we raised our children in Aurora. And when my children were in the West Aurora school system, when they were in 5th grade, the school board passed out Bibles to all the 5th graders. And one of our very politically active Jewish women in our community went on a rampage about that. And she sued the board and won.
Yeah.
And the Bibles ceased to be distributed in the public schools.
Right. Yeah. There was a very famous Supreme Court case. I think it was there was one in 1947 and then another in the early 60s that really put an end to school prayer. Because it was seen as promoting the establishment of religion. Even though, the people who passed out the Bible could say, look, it's a Bible. Jews like the Bible too. And we're not saying you have to read it. We're just saying it's, Bible's part of American culture. But that argument has really been struck down. There's also another famous case, which actually involved a rabbi. In 1991, Rabbi Leslie Gutterman, who is in Providence, Rhode Island, gave a benediction. It's either an invocation, I think it was an invocation at a public high school graduation. He's a Reform rabbi. And a Jewish family sued the school for allowing a rabbi to give an invocation. And they won. It was a 5-4 decision that essentially said you cannot have a sectarian prayer at a public high school graduation. Now, again, this is not exactly followed all the time. Certainly, I've given prayers at different public events and things like that, but it's really not in a public forum. If we're going to give a prayer, it should be as bland. Essentially, it should be, something that's very universal.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
that also happened in Aurora when
Yeah.
the sports boosters would have invocations before their dinner every fall and every spring. And the only objection I had, and I did speak of my objection, was when a minister gave, or a priest, when they gave it, it was always, they ended the prayer in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord.
Yeah.
And that was what I objected to. I didn't object. I said, well, you've just dismissed me and my family and any other Jewish athletes and their families from that prayer being meaningful for us. It left us out.
Yeah.
And they said to me, and their answer to me was, well, we've had the rabbi too. And I said, yes, you have, but he gave a non-sectarian prayer. He didn't speak in Hebrew.
There you go.
And I
you go.
said, if they pray in the school, they can't invoke the name of Christ.
Right.
But they didn't seem to agree with me.
Right. Exactly. I mean, this is very important. Language matters. I mean, George Washington, in his farewell address, such a beautiful speech. I encourage everyone to read it. He talks about religion, but he doesn't talk about Jesus. He talks about God, and he talks about religious faith. And what was it? There was a famous quote from, I think it was Dwight Eisenhower. He said, I want every American to believe in God, but I don't care which God they believe in, something like that. The idea was religion generally is good, but it should be whatever religion one chooses. I like to, whenever it's like a national holiday for like Jews or Christians or Muslims, the president always issues a declaration. Now, those kind of declarations, like I looked at Joe Biden's Easter declaration, it talks about Christ. And at first I was like, oh, the guy talked about Christ. Then I thought, you know what? It's about Easter. So I said, okay, if it is a public official reflecting a particular sectarian holiday, that's okay. But if it's a presidential proclamation about, let's say, Thanksgiving, which is, you shouldn't use Jesus or any kind of language there too. If it's a president giving a speech and says, God bless America, president shouldn't say, in the name of Jesus. So again, it's complicated, but language matters. Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wondered about, they have a chaplain in Congress that makes an invocation or whatever at the beginning of the congressional sessions. And I have heard when it's a Christian minister, them mentioning, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit or whatever, or mentioning Jesus in those prayers, though most of the chaplains try very hard to keep it general, keep the invocation general to God. But if we do have separation of church and state, why do we mention God in Congress at all?
Because it's not, see, this is a complicated thing. Because it's not as if we don't bring our religious convictions to our politics. We do. We as a congregation are politically active because of our Jewish values. Our senators and congresspeople, they have religious values too. So it's not, we don't want people to not have religious values. That's sort of it's tricky. On the other hand, we don't want those religious values to be the sole criterion by which people pass legislation. So there has to be good secular reason. So I don't object if somebody talks about God because, well, there's a couple arguments you could make here. You could say, and this is a very fair argument, you could say that it's good to have some public displays of religion. If you believe that religion is a positive social good, which Washington certainly did, Jefferson may not have. Jefferson may have been more towards, Sarah, what you suggested, that maybe a chaplain shouldn't even mention God at all. I think Jefferson would probably agree with you. Jefferson would probably say, keep God out. Don't even put it on the currency. You take a coin, now you look, it says, in God we trust, doesn't it? In the Pledge of Allegiance, it says under God, which was added in the 1950s, or Eisenhower. Jefferson would probably say, get rid of all of that. Washington would say, it's good to talk about God because it is part of a national character, that religion promotes morality, it promotes, which is what he would say, some would disagree, that it promotes a sense of community and that it's a positive social good. By the way, that's sort of government policy. I mean, religious groups we don't have to pay taxes. It's a great thing. Nonprofits don't either, because it is seen as a positive social good. So saying God in that sense is just a way of acknowledging the importance of religion in American culture. But going into more sectarian language, like let's say a rabbi gives a prayer before Congress and says, and we pray for the ingathering of the exiles into Israel, and we pray that America remains a place of, or if you're Christian saying, that Jesus comes back to America, that crosses the line. And people do cross the line. This is not, even though the Supreme Court essentially ruled it unconstitutional, what are you going to do? I mean, if a minister gets up and gives one of these prayers, people can be angry, but you can't really go and arrest them. It's something that often happens, even though it's not really supposed to.
It's interesting that you said that under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance relatively recently. I didn't realize that.
Well, yeah, and you know why? It all goes back to the Cold War. It goes back to the Cold War, where it was the United States was seen as a religious country fighting the atheist communists who didn't believe in anything, which was essentially true. I mean, all religion was sort of suppressed by the Soviet Union. And so kind of the idea was God is on the side of democracy and capitalism and so forth. So yeah, it was under Eisenhower that under God was added to the pledge. I don't know when the language in God we trust was put on currency. That might have been earlier. But these are, in fact, there's a group that constantly sues the government saying that we shouldn't have under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And this actually made it to one of the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals rejected it and said it's fine. And they essentially said what I kind of said, is that it's harmless. It is not, having under God doesn't promote one religious group over the other. Now, if you're Muslim, you could say, it doesn't, but God is a general enough term that it would cover sort of a higher power. One could say it persecutes atheists, though. One could say, hey,
I think atheists and humanists that don't believe in a deity, but
right,
believe in morality in the country are probably some of the people that object to that.
exactly. Yeah. They object to our tax break too, which is not good. We like that tax break. But in general, there's another, essentially what someone like Washington or Eisenhower, even, the Declaration of Independence does talk about God. It says there's a creator. So the sort of general foundations of the United States are still in some sort of very broad, universal religious framework, not particularist, but broadly, there's an interesting question. Most Americans still say they wouldn't elect an atheist president, which is interesting. Although essentially presidents have gotten less religious over time. Obama is the most religious president over the last few. Obama rarely went to church. Trump rarely went to church. Bill Clinton did occasionally, but Biden goes regularly, which is different than the last couple presidents. Okay, Marcia. Oh, unmute. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Okay.
That's okay.
I just wanted to address that for a second. There was a poll done, when Bernie Sanders was, big in the primaries and everything, that they about what president they would not elect. And atheists and socialism were like next to last. Last was Jewish of who they would not elect. But I wanted to say that Newt Gingrich, on many occasions, and I'm sure he wasn't the only politician who said it, that America is a Christian country. He said that many times. And like, so how many millions of people did he exclude by saying that? And then the other thing is, I was in fourth grade when that under God was added, and I was incensed. Because my dad was a big believer that you don't mix religion with state ever. And he was brought up in an Orthodox household. He rejected a lot of the ritual and observances later, but I mean, he never did not identify himself as Jewish. But I remember coming home and said, Dad, you know what, they're making us say this. He said, you don't have to say it if you don't want to. And I didn't. I would just kind of,
Fascinating.
my breath. Yeah, I was only 9 years old, and I just was incensed with that.
Interesting, his Orthodox background. In our last session, we're going to talk about Trump, and the fascinating thing is that the Orthodox community today is about 80% Republican, which is a huge, I mean, there's a huge difference today in the Jewish community. In fact, there's an article, I don't know if you saw this, there's this Twitter account called the Libs of TikTok, and it's a sort of it's horrible, horrible stuff. This is the account that tries to find teachers that they think are promoting left-wing propaganda, and they essentially send out these videos mocking these teachers, mocking these students. It's a horrible. And a newspaper reporter for the Washington Post found out who ran Libs of TikTok. So they essentially, this reporter, it was anonymous. This reporter found it, and it's an Orthodox Jewish woman who runs this. Very pro-Trump, was January 6th participant. And so the Orthodox community today, not all Orthodox. I'm talking, you know, this again. I don't want to cast dispersions on but it is the dynamic in American Jewish life has changed significantly. Okay, yes, who's next?
On the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, they had famous people reading parts of the Gettysburg Address, and Obama got some blowback because he read, you know, this nation shall have a new birth of freedom. People were blowing out, well, this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. But Lincoln kind of continued writing the Gettysburg Address even after he had given it to get it right. And I think there's a version of the Gettysburg Address without under God in, but then when Lincoln penned his final version months later, he added under God, this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, but it may not have been in the original speech that he gave.
That is so interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. Lincoln, when we talk about Lincoln, it'll be Lincoln and the Jews had a sort of complex relationship. He was generally more open to the Jewish community, but Lincoln didn't have much exposure to the Jewish community. He really, he had a little bit, but he was not, he didn't have the kind of relationship that even Washington had with the Jewish community. And the Jewish community under Lincoln was still very small. There were some, it was growing, but when Lincoln really emerged in Illinois, there was just a tiny Jewish population at the time. Any other questions or thoughts? Probably a good place to stop. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Something funny. When I was a kid, I grew up in a Jewish community, and Abraham Lincoln's name was Abraham, and he had a beard. And I thought he looked Jewish, and I was sure that Abraham Lincoln was Jewish. And when I found out that he wasn't Jewish, I was really shocked.
Interesting. I mean, primarily, there is a lot of interesting evidence that Alexander Hamilton, certainly he didn't identify as Jewish, but one of his parents, I think it's his father, was probably Jewish. I mean, there's really a lot of evidence. There's a book called Alexander Hamilton and the Jews, and we were supposed to have the author of that book come and speak, and he couldn't because that's when Vanessa's father passed away. But we'll have him again. But the book is fascinating. And certainly the beautiful thing, to go back, the founders of America, one of the great, I think, in the great qualities that they believed in religion as a positive social good, but they did not believe that one religion had a path to the truth. And that sort of religious pluralism was kind of baked into America from the very beginning. And Washington was so important because Washington was maybe not an intellectual, but he was a pragmatist, and he put into practice these Enlightenment ideals that shaped American history and that essentially set the path for future presidents. So next week, we'll get all the way through Lincoln, and I hope to see all of you again. See you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank
This was
you.
awfully good.
But
Very
thank you.
good.
Thank you.
Very
Good to
Thank
see you.
you.
Lyle.
Thank you very
Interesting.
much.
Drive safely.
Mhm.
Hi, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.